do want to welcome you all today to our SACNAS webinar, The Art of Negotiation, which is actually a part of SACNAS's National Postdoc Appreciation Week of events. Briefly, since 2009, the National Postdoc Association sponsored the National Postdoc Appreciation Week to recognize the significant contributions that postdocs make to U.S. research and discovery. Organizations from across the world participate by holding special events all week, sometimes even all month. And this is actually the second time that SACNAS is participating in this week-long event. We completely agree that postdocs are crucial to the scientific community, and we want to show you that we appreciate you. Some of you may already know me, but in case you don't, my name is Elizabeth Aguilera, and I am the SACNAS Professional and Leadership Programs Manager. We're very excited for you to be joining us today, and we have a wonderful set of panelists to be discussing the webinar topic. We do also have Angel, who is a SACNAS team member that is our chat moderator for today, and will be posting snippets of information in the chat. So be on the lookout for that. Before we move forward, I do want to take the time to acknowledge the native lands that we all reside on as part of SACNAS tradition. I currently am residing on Cheyenne and Arapaho territory over in Colorado, and SACNAS is based out of California, which is the original homelands to over 200 tribal nations, bands, and rancherias of Native American and Indigenous people. I would like to take this time to acknowledge the original inhabitants of the various regions that we all live in, work in, as well as honor the rich culture of the Indigenous people across the country. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists today. We have Michelle, who is joining us over from the University of California, Merced. We also have another Michelle, Michelle Heck, who is joining us from the USDA, David Canatella, who is joining us from the University of Texas in Austin, and then Cheryl Wilga joining us from the University of Rhode Island. Before we move forward into the webinar, I would like to invite you all, the audience members, to post your questions either in the chat box, or you are more than welcome to come to screen and ask your question to the panelists verbally. I do want to remind you all to be mindful and respectful, both in the chat and when you're asking questions. And when you are answering or asking a question, please let us know your full name, what institution you're coming from, or location. So with that, I would like to allow all of our panelists to introduce themselves and maybe provide a snippet of advice before we get started with the Q&A. I'll go ahead and pick David.
Okay, fine. Hi there, I'm David Canatella, coming to you from Austin, Texas. I'm a professor here at the University of Texas at Austin for about 32 years, I guess now. Let's see, a snippet of advice just to get started. Never accept a job offer right away.
Go next. I'm Michelle Heck, and I work for the U.S. Department of Agriculture up on the campus of Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. And we study vector biology and functional genomics. And a snippet of advice that I would share is ask for what you need to be successful, nothing more and nothing less.
Do you want me to go next? Michelle Nishiguchi, you can call me Nish, so we'll distinguish the two Michelles. I'm at University of California, Merced. I've been here a whopping a little over 2 years, but I was previously in New Mexico State University for 21 years. And my stipulated advice would be to really think about what you want out of the faculty that you're going to belong to, as well as what they want out of you. So you're in a very strong position of negotiating what you need, like what Michelle said. And so it's one of the few times we're going to have a lot of power to do so.
And I'm Cheryl Volga. I am at the University of Rhode Island. Previously, I was at the University of Rhode Island for 15 years. Then I went to the University of Alaska in Anchorage, and now I'm back at the University of Rhode Island. So I've moved twice, so I have some experience in doing that, negotiating twice, well, 3 times actually, if you count the initial one. But I guess my first snippet of advice is, study the institution, what it is, its mission, who's there, how you can contribute, and so know it. So when you go on your interview, you can talk a little more intelligently or knowingly, I guess, about the institution and what you can offer, but also what the institution can offer you. So.
To get the chat or questions going, I want to follow up with what Cheryl just said. So how do you think there are differences in negotiating in different sectors? And maybe you all can collectively answer this question, but for example, when you're negotiating for a position in academia versus industry, etc. Are there similarities or do you think are the differences?
Not sure I've always applied to academia, so I don't know if maybe Michelle can offer some experience there.
Sure. I've applied and negotiated offers both in academia and in government. And government jobs are a lot more constrained in terms of what they can offer for negotiation, because they have to follow federal law. And at universities, you can sometimes get different types of things. But that said, usually, starting salary is something that you can negotiate in both government and academia. And government jobs, civilian government jobs, there are different GS levels, and each GS level has a various number of steps. And so if the job is listed at a certain GS level, you can negotiate the step for a higher salary. One thing you want to keep in mind is the government job is on a 12-month, the salary is for 12 months. And an academic job is you maybe have a 9-month appointment. And so if the starting salary for a 9-month appointment for an assistant professor is say $80,000, if the job in government is at $80,000, you can try to negotiate that higher, because in the university setting, you could increase your salary by summer salary, getting a grant and buffering the salary over the summer. So that's not possible in government. And so you can, work to sort of do that. Space, you're going to be negotiating space, what your lab space looks like, how clean it is, the condition that it's in, equipment, all of those things, can be negotiated. But Cheryl brings up an excellent point. Know your institution, know who's there, what equipment is there. And I think coming with that information on how you can leverage and use existing resources and the things you might need specifically to build your program.
And I would add on to that too, is that you also knowing your institution. So if it's a public university versus a private, don't over exceed the chair or the dean might say, we have a limit on what we can give you a startup. And if that's a hard line, don't say, well, then I want another 500,000 more, because a lot of public universities don't have that kind of money. And so that's something, and that would just make the people at the university upset. So just kind of understand the limitations, but be very upfront on it. Like when someone asks you, what do you need to be successful with your research program? Definitely list, equipment needs, space, whatever, that should all go there. And talk to the people that have done that before to get an idea of what's a reasonable thing for an assistant professor. You know, obviously Cheryl and I have moved and senior professors, so then we're able to ask for a little bit more because of our experience. But as someone coming in right out of a postdoc, you know, you have to go within your boundaries too. Not to say that, you know, a lot of times if you can, and if you have a grant that's coming with you, a lot of universities, you are a very good candidate because you're bringing your money. So it just makes you more, you know, people want you from all over the place. So if you have an F grant or something like that, it just makes you a lot more marketable too. So.
Yeah, to build on what Nishi said, that was a really good point about, you know, asking for an extra $500,000 for a piece of equipment. Say, if you're at an institution where that sort of ask wouldn't be possible, one thing you could do is to request that. So institutions can submit, you know, major instrumentation grants to NSF and NIH, and usually there's a limit of, you know, 2 submissions per institution. And so you could request to be your institution's you know, submission for a piece of equipment and build a you know, indicate your willingness to build a coalition of faculty who are also NIH supported to get that piece of instrumentation there, and do the legwork to get the grant. And then in return, the university will support your submission. So there are, you know, some ways which you can help work with the university to ultimately get that piece of equipment. But what you really want to make sure is that if the university is hiring you to do a specific job and they're not providing that equipment to you, that it's clear you won't be able to do that portion of it until you have access to this equipment, or you would need to work collaboratively or whatever, right? Just to make it clear in the negotiations. Without that, this is what would be possible.
Yeah, and there's quite a few things you could negotiate for that are not quite so monetary. Grad assistants, teaching assistants, postdocs even. You can negotiate a reduced teaching load. Usually you get that anyway, but it varies between 1 and 5 years. So you can ask for more years of a lower teaching load so you can establish your research program. Things like that, summer support, that was already mentioned. So there's quite a few things that you can negotiate in addition to, you know, just salary and startup. And remember that they want you to succeed. They're not going to hire anyone unless they're going to succeed. So it's important that you negotiate for what you need to succeed. And there could be, you know, through collaborations with other faculty too, or centers, things like that. And if you're, I don't know if everybody is at I think everybody's a postdoc in this one. So other things that if you're moving when you're more senior, you can ask about how many years towards tenure, or if you haven't gotten tenure yet, or how many years towards emeritus status, because sometimes that clock resets when you go somewhere else, but you can negotiate that as well. Of course, moving expenses, that's another thing that you could negotiate. There's quite a lot. I think one thing a lot of people ask about is spousal hires, but you don't negotiate that until you've been offered a position, and then you sort of bring it up. So wait until you're offered and then bring it up. I've seen it go both ways. URI has quite a few spousal hires, so the colleges work together for things like that. And I know, I'm trying to remember where it was. It doesn't matter, but there was one person who was interviewing at a place and they were offered a position, but they never brought up a spousal hire. And apparently their spouse was something that that institution could have used and would have been happy to hire, but they didn't bring it up. And so they ended up not taking the job. And I don't remember how they learned this. I think it was after the fact. So this is also where knowing your institution could help. If you have a spousal hire or partner hire, look around and see if there's an appropriate place for that person as well. You never know what could happen, because institutions, some like spousal hires because you're more likely to stay if you both have a job. If you're both looking for jobs in academia, that's a little bit trickier. So I guess that's another 2 cents worth there.
Yeah, I think some places will also, once you bring it up, they will try to help facilitate, let's say your spousal partner, what equivalent, whatever, does not want to work in academia. And so if it's an area where they have connections with industry or something else, some universities will try and reach out saying, okay, there's this company here or whatever. I've known places to do that, most of the time, obviously, those are places where they're in bigger cities because there's a lot more resources there. But as long as you have to let everyone know, that's the thing. And like what Cheryl said, after the fact that you've been offered, the university wants you and they want, you're the top choice. They want you to succeed. They're making a big investment because they've gone through this whole search process. They spent all this time and money choosing you and then giving you all this money to make you successful. So they really want, it's like they're banking on you to be a good faculty, member or whatever. And so you can really provide that information saying, I will stay because my spousal equivalent has a job here. We're not going to move. And like Cheryl said, there's a lot of places that are trying to make, especially if there's two academics, they're really trying to help both sides of make it work.
To follow up on that, does the spousal position have to be listed or can you try to negotiate? Okay, I saw no.
It's rare when they are, but you could look at cohort hires. So there's cohort hires that, two people, I think we actually did have a partnership, both advertise or apply, and both got in to at least the interview stage of a cohort hire. So that's a good opportunity for partnerships. But they're not advertised ahead of time. No, this is where, if you know what the institution could use or needs, or, talk to the faculty and maybe ask to talk to somebody in that department if it doesn't, during the interview process, if it's not too obvious, and see what their needs are. But
yeah, there might be situations where you maybe the other person, the other spouse, partner, whatever, doesn't want to do a research teaching job. They just might want to teach. So I've had friends who, one is in the research position, the traditional tenure track, and the other one is working as an adjunct or as a teaching fellow, or not teaching fellow, but like a professor of teaching, and because he didn't want to do research. And so it just depends, it depends on the two people that are coming in together. And sometimes it could be a different school, a different college, like someone's doing biology, other one's doing English, or, whatever. So then it's going to be two departments, probably two different schools or colleges, and it'll work that way. And then that's when the deans have to do the conversation also. So I think David and Cheryl would know more about the dean level, because that comes up to then this dean has to talk to this dean and see if there's going to be a line to hire. And when I was department chair at my old university, we had something like that where we had a hire, and then his wife was hired actually by a different department. She applied separately. They have different last names, but I knew that she was applying there. And then I nudged my dean. This was the other person was a dean in ag. I said, hey, we're this guy that we're hiring. We really want him and we want him to be happy. So can you take a look at this candidate? And it turned out she was her top candidate. So it worked out great that they were both hired. But just that knowing, and then knowing who to, that my dean had talked to their dean, that was a real good move. So
yeah, deans talk, and if they want you, then they're going to go talk to the other dean and see if they can make a deal. And we've done that at least in 2 or 3 instances now, where the significant other started at URI as a one was a visiting professor. Actually, 2 were visiting professors. One was a research associate, and then another was a teaching faculty member. So all across the board, and others were regular tenure track in another department. That happened at least 3 times that I know of as well. And at least one of the visiting professors has now turned into a tenure track position. And, like some want to teach, but some want to do research. Now, sometimes the research associate, that's probably you know, a soft money position. So that person would have to write their grants to pay their salary. But there's also other ways to get a salary in there as well, you know, directing a center or helping an REU program, or, you know, all kinds of things like that, where you need some support from, you know, someone who has a PhD. There's lots of different positions that could happen.
Let's see, sorry. One thing I would add is, we're talking about spousal hires, but you know, you may be applying to a place where they're just not going to do a spousal hire and they don't have the resources, but they might be willing to do something like, you know, give your spouse PI status and some lab space, or maybe a temporary teaching appointment, or maybe a guarantee that, you know, the next time there's a position open, that your spouse would be, you know, automatically interviewed for the position. So there's, you know, I think the message there is to be creative in your thinking. If at first they say, well, we can't do spousal hires. And the other thing, maybe someone said this, but when you're interviewing, no one should be asking you if you have a spouse, or if there's a spousal issue that they will need to, you know, need to deal with. And I've heard varying opinions from people whether the interviewee actually brings it up, should bring it up or not. Some people who feel they're in a strong position, you know, they're interviewing and they say, well, you know, I feel I should let you know I have a spouse and we would need to do something to accommodate that person. Or on the other hand, some people say, you know, absolutely nothing. But frankly, I almost always in my experience, it's like we manage to figure out if there's a spousal, you know, a spousal component before the negotiation gets very far.
And most are willing to do that if there's, you know, a spot that they could fit in, because they know they're going to be able to keep both of you longer if you're both there and happy. So,
yeah.
And they get a twofer. Not for one salary though, but although
I would say one thing to avoid is this was done in the dark ages. I don't know if it's still done, is sometimes people said, well, we can share a position. Don't ever do that. You know, so like one academic line and then there's two of you doing it, because what ends up happening is the two people, because generally you're starting your careers, you're working like crazy. And so you're probably working the same amount of time as you would as being paid for one, but you're only getting paid each half. And that's not an ideal situation. So I would try to avoid something like that. If it's one of you getting a job offer, you know, and then saying, okay, there needs to be a second one. Don't ever go for that sharing, because that just doesn't end up very well. I think people end up very unhappy in that kind of situation. So.
And that reminds me too, if people talk to you about a joint appointment with another department, make sure everything is spelled out for each department, because you'll have a tenure home, you know, where most are 51% or 49, or even a bigger difference, where most of your tenure will be determined by that department, with some letters and things from the other department or college, depending on how that goes. But it needs to be clear, because, and both colleges, both departments need to stick to that percentage, because it can easily get overwhelming if both decide, you know, they need more of your time than what you can give and what's spelled out in that letter as well. So just make sure that's in writing.
Yeah, there you say get it in writing, huh? Hey, is anyone, so it sounds like at least one of you have gone through the negotiation job, Ronaldo, that's pretty great. Have any of you interviewed already yet, or in the process of getting ready to apply for jobs? Or what are some of the questions you might have in terms of when you get to that position? Everyone's so quiet.
While we're waiting on that, I do have something else that came to mind is you can defer a year or so as well. When I was offered a position initially out of a postdoc, I had been offered another postdoc for 1 year to help set up a lab at Harvard. And so, and I was offered a position at URI. So I thought, wow, that would be really great to see somebody set up a lab. This was a senior faculty member who was recruited to Harvard, and to help him set up a lab and go through all that. And so I asked URI if I could defer a year so that I could do that and still do research, but also help set up the lab at Harvard. And they agreed that it was a good thing because it would create networks and collaborations, and learning how to set up a lab was just invaluable. The year before I knew I would be setting up a lab at URI. So defers are fairly, I don't know if they're fairly common, but if it's for a good reason and they can, the university is often willing to do that. I mean, they'll hire, an adjunct or lecturer to teach the courses if they really needed you to teach any courses that first year. So if the deferral is for a good reason, maybe to learn a new technique to finish, the research project you're working on, or something like that, that the university will see as something that's going to be helping you, I guess, get on your feet at their institution, then they're likely to approve that.
We do have a question from the audience, Jackie Shea. Since salary is often commensurate upon experience, how is it possible to know how much you are worth if you get a low offer for salary?
Yeah, Jackie, I put in something in there. So with public universities, all the salaries are because we're being paid by tax dollars. Mm-hmm. So that's all public. So like Cheryl, she's at a public university. David, you're at a public university too. So all the salaries are there. You can actually look at individual people and they will have it listed as what, like, so you can look me up, look up any one of us. I didn't know about the government, Michelle, but that they're, because we're paid by tax dollars.
Yeah, the government salaries are online as well.
Yeah, because it's government. So that's all available, and you can see what the different levels are in terms of knowing your experience and then where you would fit in. And again, like different divisions. So the sciences are probably, the salaries are higher than the humanities. The business schools are always the top at all, usually, I think. And then on top of that is the medical schools. But like with medical schools, a lot of times it's they're big salaries, but you have to pull a lot out with soft money. So they'll say, we're going to give you your first 3 years of salary, and then after that, you have to come up with 75% of your salary on grants. So a lot of the professional schools, sometimes even more, depending on what school you are at. So there's a lot of pressure. Of course, you're not teaching as much because you're expected to bring in a lot of grant money. So there's, like pros and cons of having that. My colleagues at medical schools they're always writing grants with other colleagues, pulling in 10% salary from this grant and 20 from here, so that they can make up that difference. And some people don't mind that. I find it a little stressful to do that. So
yeah, a couple of questions came in on the chat. All great points, Nishi. Can moving expenses be negotiated? Absolutely, even for postdocs. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can. We are allowed to pay moving expenses on grants and for postdocs. So that if you're going for a postdoc and you want that reimbursed, that's something you can do. With regards to what to ask for and your startup money and equipment money, you should request for that to be in an account that you're in charge of, not that you have to submit a purchase order that's going to be paid for by an account that you don't have control over. So especially for like large pieces of equipment, and that helps to give you really good negotiating power when you talk to the companies and the vendors. Working with the vendors, you have your startup money that you've negotiated with the university, but you can also negotiate with the vendors. And one of the tricks that I learned from my father when I was younger, buying cars and so on. And it is how I got a really great price on our lab's first mass spectrometer. I told the sales guy, I'm authorized to spend, this much money. And he was asking for like the piece of equipment, the quote was like $65,000 over. I said, if you can get the price point at this much, I have the authority to make the decision today. If you keep it at, 265,000, I have to, approach my supervisor, and she doesn't even have the authority to spend that money. Then it's all paperwork and competing bids, and, you might even lose the contract. And then they, revise the offer within the hour for the price that I was allowed to spend. And so like the companies are also willing to negotiate. So just think about that when you're starting up the lab, how much you really want to spend, and you do have a lot of power to negotiate the price of things down. But
yeah, always ask for an educational discount, always. So,
For
yeah.
even a young investigator, I think a lot of companies like VWR Fisher give a young investigator like starting lab discounts or whatever too. And you can also, like, if they are doing a cluster hire, or there's two people getting hired at the same time, you can combine resources. So that happened with me. I was hired at the same time as one of our junior faculty, and we do very similar work. So we said, okay, let's combine, and we only buy one of these. So then you save a little money for your own stuff, which is really nice. I think that also helps. You just have to find out, who is interested in buying this, or pitching in. But there was another one about getting things in writing too. And I would say yes, because deans change, department chairs change. And so there's a loss of memory, or maybe amnesia. So you want to say the previous chair said I could have this space, and then all of a sudden the new chair might say, well, I don't see it in writing. So you get everything in writing, and then you have something to back it up. And not saying that places would be not good about supporting you, but it's an institutional memory thing. So just that when you sign on.
I'm sorry. And I would add to that, any conversation in person that you have with the negotiator, reiterate that conversation to them in an email. It's sort of like, well, just to remind, we talked the other day and you said you thought it would be possible to do such and such. So again, it's the issue of institutional memory. And also, since I mentioned negotiator, I think it's strategic to figure out who is your negotiator, the person you're interacting with. Who are they really working for? Are they working for the dean? Are they actually really working for the department, to try and bring this person in, or are they somewhere in between? Lots of times they're somewhere in between. They want to help you get the job, but they have to keep the dean happy. And it's also worth trying to find out, maybe when you interview, it's like, lots of times the negotiator is the department chair. So how many times has this department chair actually hired someone? Because they may not know the ins and outs. If you're their first hire, they may be trying in good faith to do stuff, but they may not have the experience to figure out how to get what you need. So so I think that's an important thing to sort of figure out.
And you can ask when you're interviewing, ask all the assistant professors that you meet with, did you get what you needed? Ask him what you like about the place. What do you think could be improved? Or your teaching load, your space, how many RAs or TAs did you get? Moving expenses. Ask more than one person so that you can, get a variety. You can see the salaries if they're a public institution. A private you can't, but ask anyway. Ask around when you're interviewing, and you can sort of get a feel for what's allowed, what's not, how much you can ask for. As far as clearly for research equipment and supplies, you need to ask for what you need to succeed. But things like RAs, TAs, postdocs, teaching load, office space, summer support, is just so many things that you can ask different people and see what they did, especially if they're more recent hires, if they're, junior faculty that have been hired more recently, because then they'll have, the most recent experience that'll help you.
Yeah, and along those lines, also ask about grant proposal submission support and grant preparation support. What is available, and what level of funding does the grant have to be at to get institutional support to submit a proposal and pull together a proposal. That's really important. And when I was interviewing, that is extremely variable across institutions.
Mhm. Yeah, try to get everything that you can in writing, the salary, the startup, the space, the teaching load, postdocs, RAs, TAs, summer support, moving expenses. And a lot of times they'll have a list of startup, things that are included in the startup. So just don't be afraid to ask, I'd really like that in writing. Send it back and have them at it. They're going to respect you as well for being paying close attention to your career and what you need. So
We did receive a question during the registration process from a participant about if you do counter essentially what for a larger salary, how often than not is the offer either completely terminated or is there a counter back? In other words, it sounds like this individual is scared to maybe ask because
they'll counter back. I've only ever heard of one instance where they said, "I'm sorry, we're going on to the next, candidate," and that person was being very, very unreasonable. So I think this is where talking with the people, assistant faculty, especially when you're interviewing, talking to them and seeing what's going on. But they'll just counter. They'll come back and say, because I've done this before, and you go to the dean and say, well, can we ask for a little bit more, because they're, justify it, and I justify it. This person is really great. We want them, we're giving them less of this, so maybe we can give more of this, and she'll, they'll either agree or come up with an alternative. If they can't come up with more salary, well, how about summer salary? How about another RA? How about a TA? So there's always a balancing act that can come up with that. And I think most institutions, either your family members can get free tuition. I think I don't know if it runs from totally free to a certain percentage. It depends, I guess, on where you're at, but that's another thing that really adds up if, when you start having children. So ask, it can't hurt. They can just say no or counter. So as long as it's something not totally unreasonable. So it's good to get sort of that general area just by talking to other people, but also looking on the web. You can see what people's salaries are for public university. Private, I guess you'd have to talk to people when you interview, or talk to your colleagues who are at private institutions and see. Your postdoc advisor, hopefully will know some people too and be able to help you as far as that goes. Getting in touch with people who could answer your questions, or, how much is a, assistant professor at Harvard versus Yale or MIT, something like that. And yeah, ask. The more information you have, the better prepared you'll be for negotiating.
Yeah, some universities will allow you to also do outside activities to augment your salary. And so I have a colleague at University of Maryland who has her own company, and she pulls in more salary from her consultant, from her work as a chief scientific officer of her company. And, so the university does allow that, outside activities, as long as they're cleared by their ethics office and they're not overlapping with the duties you're doing for the university. And consulting can augment your salary as well.
Oh, yes, there's a comment in there, having multiple offers. Absolutely, yes. So you could say, oh, I have the offer from this institution and this is what they're giving me, and then you give it to them. So I did that, and until I was happy. And I didn't do it 20,000 times, but went back and forth once to each place. And then, made a decision. So absolutely, use that. Oh, what I was going to say about the consulting, be sure that the company, there are some granting agencies that I think if you have a conflict of interest or I can't remember the exact deal, but they won't let you apply for a grant from that agency if your company, I don't exactly remember what it is. Maybe Michelle knows, but you just have to be careful about that. But I heard that they started a company, but then they weren't able to apply for, and I think it was NSF or NIH or something like that because of whatever this other company was that he had. Does anybody know anything more about that?
I think you have to work with the compliance before you get into that. You just ask the compliance office and they will look into that. There's a lot of paperwork you have to sign to make sure that there's no overlap. Resources that you have used for this can't be used for that, and there's all these other things that you have to agree to, but it can be done. But yeah, I just want to make sure you don't kind of block yourself out of any possible funding, like from NSF or something as well. So
right, but consulting is pretty common.
We do have another question from Alejandro. In a position where teaching and research are both important, so 50% teaching, 50% research, what is the best way to negotiate to delay the teaching of one course so that you can dedicate more time to research and get grants for, let's say, 2 to 3 years?
I think you just have to ask.
yeah.
I mean, just ask and make your argument for why, what's your plan? If you're going to ask for something, then you really have to have thought through why it's going to help the university, why it's going to help the department as well as just helping you.
And if you have that one pager of, the aims, like for the NIH style aims or the NSF, intellectual merit, broader impacts, if you have like a one pager or something like that, it's like, look, this is what I'd like to submit, but I would like to have time to work on this. And the other thing you can ask for is like, if you have several courses you're going to be teaching, you really want to put a lot of effort into, you can't put all your effort into all three at once and have it succeed. So maybe working hard on this class, and then you'll have that set. And then the next semester or the next year, you'll put a lot of effort into this class, because it does take time. I guess it's about 3 times that I've taught something where it's really where I like it. And then it's small tweaks after that. So it takes time to build on that. And you can't be, doing like 3 big classes that take a lot of your time every semester. It's just too much. So you can justify it for the class, justify it for the grant. Yeah,
most people will they will protect the junior faculty and give you like one course, depending on the teaching load. If you're a teaching university, they're going to give you more courses, but they won't make you teach like 8 million different courses. Is that 1 or 2 courses that you're responsible for? You might be team teaching, so that the load gives you more time to work on grants. The one thing I will say is that if you get the teaching release, then the expectation, and this is looking down the road at promotion, is that your output on research is going to have to be good. So let's say you have a 2-1 teaching load, so 2 in one semester, 1 the other, and you get 1 class dropped. So that's like a 30% reduction. So your productivity in terms of publications and grants getting funded has to go up. So it's not just like, oh, well, I'm gonna, so there's got to be, there's an equilibrium that has to be, the give and take. And so I think sometimes, be really careful with that, because if you're only teaching 1 or 2 and the rest of the faculty teaching 2 or 3, and your productivity isn't higher, that doesn't go well with your promotion folder. So initially, obviously, the first 2 years, they know that you're getting things ramped up, but this is looking at the long road, 5 years, when you're getting your folder together for promotion and tenure. So I know that is an easy thing to fall into. But like David said, usually most places give you course release right away. And kind of what my philosophy, and everyone's different too, is that I like to, when you first get to a place, the lab might not be quite ready. You don't have any equipment yet. You're So my philosophy is to teach that semester while
Mhm.
things are getting ordered.
Mhm.
So by the time you order everything and then spring semester comes around, things are ready to go for your research and you have that semester off. So I always think of it as, it might be a little hectic, because you're like, I teach everything, but you probably can't do anything in lab anyways, because you don't have anything in there unless you adopt some old equipment or whatever. But that's what I did, and it was much better. And I recommended that to, when I was chair for faculty coming in, I said, this is my recommend. You do whatever you want, but I just see this working out well for a lot of junior faculty. So
Mhm. Yeah, and if you're moving from one position to another before you have tenure, you can ask for years towards tenure, but then be careful about that as well, because you need to know what the expectations are. If you are asking for 3 years towards tenure, that gives you 2 years to get to whatever it is you need to do at that institution to get tenure. So be careful about asking for too much time. If the disparity from where you were and where you are is very different, because then you're going to have to make that up.
We do have another question in the chat from Jackie. First of all, this is so helpful and thank you all. And they ask, are negotiations allowed during other steps on the academic timeline? So during promotion, tenure, distinguished professor, etc.
You mean after you have tenure? Let's see, during other steps.
maybe only by another job offer.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So once you're in a position, usually there's no way to get more. Some universities will have bridge money. Let's say you don't have any, your last grant ended and you're kind of waiting for some grants, you've submitted grants and you're waiting to hear back. So you're in the 6-month demilitarized zone where you don't have much funding. And some universities and departments have bridge funding for faculty to kind of tie them over. Let's say you have a technician and you don't have money for this technician, but they're written into your grant that hopefully will get funded. They might have money to help you to finish off stuff. But then again, you have to ask, because you don't ask, they're not going to know that you need that. But it's really hard to get a lot more money unless you have a counter offer. So if someone's trying to steal you to go somewhere else, then the university, if they really want you, they'll try to keep you. I don't like to play that game. I mean, people do it all the time. If you're going to look for another position, you have to, with the thought of actually going there, because maybe this other university that had this ad and you applied and they offered you the job, but you really don't want to go there. And your head said, or your chair or your dean says, nope, then you are not going to look so good if you turn that other job down, just because you're trying to use it as a negotiation tool. So I don't like that. I know people do it, but if you do that, it's with the thought of, I'm interested in going there, because also you don't want to waste the other university's time going through that whole job process. It's not really fair to them if you're not really interested. So I think that's one thing that you can make that a negotiation. I had 2 like that in my previous job, and they were actually 2 places that I was interested in going to. It wasn't just, but my dean really pushed back and gave me some terrific counter offers. So, and I was almost out the door for the first one, and then he just came back. I mean, he really surprised me, and I was like, whoa, okay, let me rethink about this. And then, yeah, and so that's what happened with that.
There's some institutions have an exceptional salary increase that usually it's a chair or a dean or something like that that will suggest that, but it doesn't hurt to talk to your chair or dean about an exceptional salary increase, which usually adds to your baseline salary. So that's, if you feel like you're doing something, fantastic in the research, and generally, you would have, I suppose you could do it for teaching too, but I generally see it for more the research end, where you get a lot of grants or a lot of publications or something like that.
We do have a question to clarify. Oh, sorry, just saw Nishi answered it, but it was from Sonia. So once you're hired and you agree to a salary, it's pretty set for the whole career, unless you have such a counter offer, so to speak.
Well, you would normally have salary increases that would go proportional to the promotions in your job. or taking on additional administrative burden, like becoming department chair or director of graduate studies or something like that. But there would be salary increases, and the universities have built in sort of, yearly base increases at some low percent to keep up with cost of living, just like other employers.
And there's a big salary increase from pre-tenure to tenure, and then from associate to full as well. So.
Yeah, and I would say like here at University of California, which was new to me until I got here, is that there are all these steps in between each one of those. So there's 6 steps between assistant to associate and another 6. And then after full, a lot of places you full and then it's just a cost of living, but at University of California, there's all these other additional steps. I don't know if UT Austin has that or whatever, that you can keep going based on merit, which is great because, once you become a full professor, like in my old university, it was like, that was it, unless you, did administration or you became a regents professor, which is very rare or whatever. But here there's like additional promotional steps. So when I got here, because I was hired as a full professor, I was like, oh, this is great. So yeah.
Yeah, and on the other hand, I've heard that about, well, I know that from the UC system, but then the other thing is sometimes I've heard that they can be really rigid about where they start you. They may be less willing to negotiate a starting salary, especially if they're hiring more than one person at the same time.
Yeah, you are right. There's 3 steps for each level. So, and cost of living increases. So it's usually there are ways, that it moves up, and most commonly people write in summer salary for their grants. But you can negotiate that as well. If you've done something special or, something extraordinary, you can always ask for an exceptional salary increase, or sometimes you can ask for a month of summer salary if you're going to work on a big complex grant like a REU or a center grant, or something like that for the university or the department. Chair, the dean, will also like that, or an advanced grant. Some of these bigger grants, they'll give you time to work on that. Usually it as summer salary, but it could be other things as well, maybe a TA or an RA to help you in other areas.
Something I could offer about that, and it's maybe very specific strategy, like when you're negotiating, it's like, well, do you want funding for an RA or a postdoc or what? And I think it's important to consider how you work, but how specifically how you write best. So for example, if you feel you're maybe not a great writer, or that it takes you a while, to get something written, you might want to be looking for a postdoc who actually has demonstrated that they can get stuff written, because it's not just an issue of doing your research. Obviously, you need to get it published. Or maybe even, if you feel that you write well and you write fast, maybe instead of a postdoc, get a technician. Someone who can basically crank out data for you, to analyze and write about. So I think there's some degree of strategy for what sort of, personnel help you ask for right at the beginning.
Yeah, that is excellent advice. And with regards to that, if you're going to ask for an RA, make sure you understand the course requirements for the graduate students, because if they have to take 2 years of courses, it's very difficult for first year graduate students to get a lot of stuff done in the lab. And so you may want to delay recruiting a graduate student until you have some shovel ready projects that could be done, a postdoc or a technician who's got the lab up and running. So just the timing of things. And also it's easier to get funding for graduate students through certain types of fellowships, National Science Foundation and so on. So whereas, postdocs, you may have to pay at a higher salary than grants could support. So those are kind of things you might want to think about.
I know we're coming up on time, but I'm going to take one last final question from Sonia in the chat. Do any of you know of crowdsourced resources, for example, lab budgets or salary budget requests? Is this common or uncommon?
I don't know of any, but one thing is that what I did for startup for both times that I moved is you just kind of write down your big equipment needs. So the big line items, if something you need is going to cost 30K or 40K, kind of get that out. But then also think about consumables. You know, if you're in the wet lab and you're doing a lot of molecular biology, that tends to be expensive. So, and if you don't have an idea, maybe ask your PI, like, what do you normally budget in a grant to get X project done for consumables a year, you know, so depending on the type of research. If you're going to go in the field, if you're a field researcher, you know, travel expenses, you want to put in money for going to national conferences, you know, to present your work. And if you have a student, you know, not just you, but your students, things like that. Then also think about the other new, like Cheryl said, salary, summer salary, whatever. And also the other thing I think we forgot to mention is some universities have a timeline of when you have to spend your startup. So depending on how their finances is, they might say, you need to spend this in 5 years. There's been a lot of change in that because of COVID. So, you know, as you all know, been this craziness for 2 years. So a lot of universities, when faculty were hired during that time, they delayed spending money for those 2 years because a lot of the year you couldn't spend the money because you weren't in the lab, you know, so there was that. But what I think is good to do is just look at, like, say, take a basic grant proposal, look and see how much it would cost to do that project, and then multiply it by how many projects that you would need or the equipment. When you're at the interview, you ask to see what kind of larger, like, you know, big confocal microscopes, things that you wouldn't normally have in your own lab that are at the university, electron microscopy, you know, mass spec, and then budget in time on that machine. Like, it costs this much per hour. So I'm not going to buy that machine, but I want to do this on that machine. So think about service that you're going to use as well. So every aspect, I kind of just break down my research and think about that on top of all these other things moving and whatnot. So think, you know, prioritize your research on that startup, and then think about the personal expenses and whatever else would help. I know the UC system, because it's so freaking expensive to live in California, they also have a negotiation, some of the places, either for housing loans or whatnot, because if you look at where a lot of the University of California schools are, there are places where coming out of postdoc, unless you have a really wealthy auntie that'll help you put a down payment house, it's really expensive to buy a home. So there's also some of those things, and other places like on the East Coast, like if you go to Harvard or over there, you're in Cambridge, that's not cheap either, or New York, or, you know, a lot of places. Austin's getting really expensive. So some universities offer that assistance on the side, and they will tell you that. That's one of the ways they recruit you, is they say, hey, we have a housing assistance program where we can help you put a down payment in a house with a low interest loan or whatever. So I know my colleague at Harvard got a no interest loan, which I was like, what? And so, yeah, which is a lot of money, right? Because when you're spending money in Cambridge, it's really expensive. But those are perks that, you know, every university has that might be different, but they're also private schools, so they can afford to do that.
All right. Well, I know we're a little over time, but I wanted to say thank you to the audience for their interactive questions, but especially thank you to the panelists and speakers for joining us today and taking the time out of their schedule to talk to us about the art of negotiation. Thank you. Thank you, Cheryl, David, Michelle, and Nish. Really appreciate you, and have a great rest of your evening.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you.